Hello and welcome back to our study of First Peter. We've been moving right along, and I've said that a couple of times now. We've looked at several smaller sections. We'll have one more small section to look at with this lesson. As you'll see on the screen, as you have seen on the screen, we're looking at First Peter chapter 3, verses 18 to 22. It's a small passage. There are some questions of interpretation. We'll touch on that a little bit. Won't necessarily solve the issue, but we will know enough about the text to understand what Peter's trying to do with what he's sharing so that we can then see what God is going to do for those who undergo suffering. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and open them up to First Peter chapter 3. We're going to be looking at verses 18 to 22, and the title of our lesson is The Just for the Unjust, as we continue our series, Hunger for Holiness, Living Pure in an Impure World. Just as a continuing summary, Peter has been writing to various people in Asia Minor about suffering, about persecution. Along the way, though, always talking about who we are in Christ and how we are to conduct ourselves and encouragement on how we can do that. Several lessons ago, we looked at Peter's showing us the example of Jesus and the way he suffered so that we may have an example. And now what he's going to do is talk about what happens to Jesus as a result of his suffering and what his suffering accomplished, such that as we move forward into the text ourselves and think about our own suffering, Peter would suggest that what God has done for Jesus, he will do for us. And of course, not in the sense that we will bring salvation to somebody like Jesus' death and suffering did, but that there is a promise that when we endure suffering, God will see us through, and there will be vindication or proving our faithfulness on the other side, so that God will demonstrate to others that we truly did belong to him. If you have your Bibles, then open them up to chapter 3, verses 18 to 21. And I'd like just to show you real quickly an outline of the text. It's a very brief outline. We could almost get away with not having an outline at all, but I do want to talk about the text in a couple of ways because there is a transition that takes place and it seems a little unnatural, but we'll see what Peter does with that. First, verses 18 through 20, we're going to see Peter's description of Jesus' suffering and the result, the purpose and the result of that. Following along that, we'll see a discussion on the symbolism of baptism, verses 21 to 22. And that stems mainly from the fact that when Peter goes on to give an example of Jesus' suffering and vindication through his resurrection, there is a reference to what Jesus did in some form or fashion with regard to what took place during the time of Noah. Won't say anything more about that because I know we're going to read that. Want you to be able to follow along and see how we watch the flow of thought as Peter describes for us what happens with Jesus. So I'll take this up and read for you verses 18 to 22. Again, I'm reading from the English Standard Version for this unit. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh and made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers, having been subjected to him. A number of things going on in that passage, of course. Let's see, as we walk through the text, some things about Jesus' suffering and what God did through the suffering and how Jesus was brought through that suffering as well. First, we see the word at the beginning of this text, for Christ suffered. The fact that that for is there means he's giving the rationale for the things that he has said previously. You want to go back and read verses 13 through 17, particularly that. You could always go back to verses 8 and look through 17. That was the passage that we looked at last lesson. But he gives the grounds for what he had said earlier. So he's talking about previous suffering and what to do in preparation for that, that there is a plan that God will have. It's better to suffer for being righteous than for doing wrong. Now he's going to talk about Jesus having suffered as a righteous person. So it first says that he suffered. Now, if you're reading a different translation, it may be that your Bible says that he died. And the reason for that is some manuscripts, a lot of manuscripts, have the word for suffering, and others have the word for dying. The majority are going to have the word for suffering. And the reason for the differences obviously have to do with, what kind of suffering did he endure? Well, we know he died. It talks about being put to death in the flesh, made alive in or by the Spirit. We'll talk about that in a moment. So clearly there is the reference to death. And some scribes may have done that and seen that. The other thing is, while I can't show it to you in English, the words for suffered and died, the way they're set up in the past tense like that, they look similar, sound similar. Likely what's happened, though, is someone has changed the word suffered to died because of the context that follows later. But what we know is the theme of Peter's letter, not only with regard to his readers, but also in his previous discussions of Jesus, he's used the word suffer. And so we can say that the suffering that he endured included death and then being made alive. But it says he suffered. We see this language earlier in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21, where it talks about having suffered. So it talks about his suffering. For Christ suffered. And of course, he did it once. And then again, that's probably one reason why we see some manuscripts say he died, because what Hebrews chapter 7, verse 27 tells us is that he died once for all. So Peter brings that up here, and he says, for Christ suffered once. He did it once. It was only necessary for him to do it once. If you go back to Hebrews again, the point that that author is making is that Jesus died once for all, and that was sufficient, whereas animal sacrifices in the past did not do that. And so that shows the superiority of Christ's suffering. As a quick side note, it is important to recognize also that the writer to the Hebrews is making an extended argument to remain faithful to the covenant, to remain faithful to Christ in light of some kind of persecution, likely a persecution where Jewish Christians may be tempted to go back to Judaism to avoid that kind of persecution. But he makes the case about the superiority of Christ over all things Jewish. And as a result, he will bring up the fact that Jesus died and made provision for sin. And as a result, there is no other provision for sin available. Peter's bringing in that same kind of thought here as he gets ready to talk about what Jesus did and what God does for him as a response or as a result. So it says, for Christ suffered once, just the one time, and the purpose or the direction of his suffering and his dying was for sins. He died for sins. There's that sacrifice language, which parallels the language you have in Hebrews and other places. Paul uses that language as well. The idea there is that Jesus died for sins. He suffered, and he didn't commit any sin himself, but he died for others' sins. Peter then emphasizes that even further with the next statement, the righteous for the unrighteous. And that's where we're getting our title for the lesson today, the just for the unjust. The word righteous and just are basically the same word. It's one word in the original language. Here we have these synonyms. Some of your translations may say just for the unjust. The point is, as has been the case up to this point, Peter has talked about suffering in a wrong way. In other words, not having done anything to deserve suffering, that you are a righteous person suffering. He says the epitome of that example is Jesus himself. He is the righteous who ends up dying or suffering for sins for the unrighteous. And what he's pointing out there is that we too are the unrighteous that he saves when he brings us his own death and resurrection, and we put our faith in him. And that's the next clause. So we have how often. He did it once. He did it for sins, and he did it the righteous as the righteous one for the unrighteous, so that, he says, he might bring us to God. Ultimately, the result is that Jesus' death and resurrection opens the door for us to come to God. Jesus is the way of salvation. He is the means of salvation. And so what we see Peter doing here is indicating that there is an end goal. There is a purpose behind Jesus' own suffering. However unjust it was, and it was, in God's economy, it was his plan so that one person die for all, and then all who believe. The purpose that we might be brought to God. So what Peter's doing here in one form or fashion is indicating that there may be times we don't understand suffering, but there is a plan. We don't always get to know that plan until sometime later, and it may be that we don't see that plan until the other side of the resurrection. But what Peter is saying here is that we do see a purpose in Jesus' suffering. He still says it was righteous for unrighteous. He does say it was for sin, but it was to bring us to God. That's the purpose. And that lines up with other places in Scripture. You can look at Paul's statements in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 14, and then 18 through 21. And you probably could go ahead and read 14 through 21 consecutively. Again, he describes how that suffering occurred, or what was the nature of that suffering. As you continue to read the rest of verse 18, it says this: having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in or by the Spirit. And there are a couple of things that we need to look at there. But let me just real quickly, before I forget, talk to you about a couple of passages you might look at that kind of have a parallel here with the idea of being put to death in the flesh, raised in the Spirit. Take a look at Colossians chapter 1, verse 22, and then you can actually see the similar language of death in the flesh and alive in the Spirit in 1 Peter 4:6. We will look at that in the next lesson. Clearly, what's going on here is a reference to Jesus' death and resurrection, put to death in the flesh, made alive in or by the Spirit. And there is interpretive question there when you say in or by the Spirit. Are we talking about he's only being raised in the Spirit, or is he being raised by the Spirit? In other words, we know that Jesus rose bodily, fully, physically. As a result, we know it doesn't mean that he only came back in spirit. But the point that Peter is making here is that it's possible what he's trying to say is that it's the Holy Spirit who brings about that idea of being brought back to life. This is going to raise a question of interpretation as we move forward, because what Peter is now going to do is talk to us about what happened by way of the Spirit of Jesus, in the next verse. And it seems a little bit out of order in some way. It seems like he doesn't necessarily have to say this, and when he does, he brings up some questions of interpretation for us. And we'll talk about a couple of options. And as I said, as we do that, I'll end up just telling you, even if we have a difficult time understanding all the details of the text, the bigger picture is what God is doing to vindicate Jesus. And in other words, his suffering was not in vain. There was a purpose behind that. That's already hinted at here. He did truly die bodily, and he was raised. It was by the power of the Spirit. Now, verse 18, it says, in which or by which he went and proclaimed or preached to the spirits in prison, because or when they did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared. He says, in which a few, 8 persons, were brought safely through water. He talks about Jesus' death and resurrection. Then he brings up a topic that is full of questions. When it says that he was in the Spirit, or the Spirit by which he went and preached or proclaimed, are we talking about Jesus after his death and before his resurrection going and preaching? When he does, who is he preaching to? And why, if he's preaching to a specific select group, is it just that specific and select group? Let me talk about the 3 possibilities here, and then see what possible solution could be found, leaving it open, knowing that there are still debates as to what's going on here. So Jesus is put to death in the flesh, made alive in the Spirit, in which or by which he then goes and preaches to the spirits in prison. Was this an action that took place between Jesus' death and resurrection? Some would suggest it is. And if that is, then the questions that are raised is, why does he only preach to those who sinned during the time of Noah? If he is speaking to those, what did he say? And is it the spirits of people who have died, or is it fallen angels who were perhaps, the way some traditions have it, the ones involved in the sons of God and the daughters of men in Genesis chapter 6? There are a lot of questions here. One of the big questions is, if it is about Old Testament people, why is he only referencing that which took place during the time of Noah? One other option is that it's Jesus before he becomes flesh. It's a pre-incarnate, or what we call a Christophany. In other words, a time in which Jesus, in his spirit, was preaching through Noah. In other words, that Noah was the one who was preaching during the time that he was building the ark. We see a parallel there in Hebrews chapter 11, where it does talk about Noah being a preacher of righteousness while he was building the ark. And there were a number of unrighteous people. Of course, the majority of humanity was that way. You don't get all of that from the book of Genesis itself. Genesis just simply says that Noah was a righteous man, and that God chose him to build an ark to save him and his family, and the rest of the world would be destroyed, so that it was the whole of humanity, except for the remnant of those 8 who were destroyed. And of course, that would include perhaps whoever the sons of God were, whether that would be a certain group of people or fallen angels, as perhaps is suggested by 2 Peter chapter 2 and in the letter to Jude as well. Is it possible that this is The spirit that raised Jesus from the dead was the spirit that spoke through Noah during the time of preparing the ark. Third, it could be possibly, and this may be a growing majority view, it's difficult to say, is it possible that this is Jesus proclaiming his triumph at his resurrection over those fallen angels? One reason to think of that is what it goes on to say about his exaltation here at the end of this section. A number of difficult questions, not easily answered. Who is he preaching to? Why just to that group? Why is he only speaking to those who lived during the time of Noah? Could it be that there were other means for them to hear a message? Who knows? When it's all said and done, what Peter does is he talks about the spirit which was used in some way to proclaim to those spirits in prison when or because they did not obey. That transition there is up for debate as well. Does it mean when they did not obey or because they did not obey? It's a participle just saying that they were not obeying. Notice the theme here, though, is that this occurred during a time when God was being patient. And one of the themes we see in the letter here, and we'll see later in 2 Peter, if you study on your own, is the fact that there is a patience of God. God is using Noah to preach. God is using Noah to build the ark to give a signal of his coming, God's coming judgment, but it's also a time of patience. God's patiently waiting in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. So there's patience there. A call for patience from Noah's life for ours as well. Of course, he goes on to say that it was just the 8 that were in the ark that were brought safely through, and they were brought safely through water. Real quick, then a recap. Jesus dies for sin, and he is going to be raised, as is indicated in this text. There is an exaltation of Jesus that comes in a moment, but in the meantime, what Peter is telling us is that Jesus' death accomplished something. The spirit that raised Jesus from the dead was in some way effective during the time of Noah, so that when Noah himself may have been suffering some kind of persecution or ridicule for building the ark when there was no reason to, there was a vindication for Noah as well. In fact, that vindication comes when the rains fall, and in all, 8 are saved through the water. Peter is talking about the purpose of Jesus' suffering, and he finds purpose in it. And in the end, God will vindicate him. God will demonstrate that there was purpose behind his suffering and that Jesus was true in who he says he was. That is more clear in our last verse of our text for today. When he brings up water, though, and he says, save through water, Peter goes in another direction and he brings up the issue of baptism. Making the transition, then, we can at least start with this way. While questions continue to surround the particulars of Peter's words regarding what happened with Noah and Jesus and the Spirit and all of that, the overall point is that just as Christ's suffering was not in vain and God brought victory to Jesus through the resurrection, there will be victory for us if we're patient. We just need to be patient to wait for that to come. And then we'll talk about that when we get to the end of our lesson, look at a little bit of application. But the point here is, regardless of how we try to understand what Peter is telling us about these events, we know that the big picture is that Jesus is vindicated. He is proven true. His suffering was not in vain. Peter does bring up being saved through water, and therefore in verses 21 and 22, he goes on to talk more about what that baptism is. There is a tradition, a number of traditions that indicate that baptism is necessary for salvation. And they actually use this text. They use a passage out of Mark chapter 16 and a couple of others, Acts 4:38 or 4:32. The point there is talking about baptism, the need for baptism for repentance and so forth. What Peter goes on to say about Noah and his family being saved through water, in other words, they were floating on the water through the ark or on the ark, he brings up baptism, but then he qualifies it in some way. He says, baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you. Does that mean that you must be baptized to be saved? Perhaps what he's saying here is that the baptism is an evidence. And it could be also that he's picking up on the theme of baptism, not from the Jewish perspective, when Jews would baptize Gentiles who became Jews to demonstrate a washing or cleansing of sin. There's something else going on with baptism. He says that here in these next few phrases. He says it now saves you not as a removal of dirt from the body. So it's clearly not simply an external cleansing. There is an actual internal change that occurs. He says, but as an appeal or a question or a confession to God for a good conscience. In other words, what he's saying is our commitment to Christ then leads to living out a good conscience. Notice that in verse 15 or 16, it was verse 16, Peter talks about being ready to give the hope, the reason for the hope that we have to do it, though, in gentleness and reverence, and also do it with a good conscience, so that no one who slanders you would have a reason for that slander. Here, he's talking about that baptism and that confession of faith, appealing to God for a good conscience. Ultimately, though, he says that this is significant through the resurrection of Jesus. So a further important statement about the resurrection of Jesus carried over from verses 18 through 20. He says that comes about through the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus' resurrection then is what provides us with our salvation. His death on the cross and his resurrection provide our salvation and provide us our life, our eternal life. Here comes a direct statement about his vindication. While Jesus suffered, and we saw earlier in chapter 2 and part of chapter 3, that suffering, the way Jesus suffered was without responding in kind. He did not return evil for evil or reviling for reviling. Rather, he was silent like a lamb to the slaughter. He gave himself over to the will of God. Peter has enjoined us that it may be necessary and in the will of God that we suffer righteousness for unrighteous people. Jesus did that. In the end, not only is Jesus raised from the dead, demonstrating that he was appropriately from God, here there's an additional statement or additional step. It says here, Jesus Christ being raised, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. So notice what's going on here. We have this exaltation. First, there's a reference to this all occurring through the resurrection of Christ. This is the way the letter opened up in chapter 1, verse 3. You can go back and read that about the living hope that we have unto an inheritance unto a living hope through the new birth brought about by the resurrection. Then we have the phrase, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God. So not only was he raised from the dead, he has ascended. He is at a position of privilege and honor and exaltation at the right hand of God. This is language we find in other places. We see it, for instance, in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 1. And rather striking, we see it in Peter's speech at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, verses 32 to 33, where he talks about Jesus having been raised from the dead and now exalted and seated at the right hand of God. What people have sought to bring harm to Jesus, God has approved Jesus, raising him from the dead and seating him in a place of exaltation. And notice the result is that there are angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. In other words, he has received exaltation such that now what you have are all of these powers, angelic beings and so forth, being subjected to Jesus. And we see language like that in Paul's letters as well, specifically where he talks about that will ultimately happen. It's happened already. It will happen even further in the end of the age when all are resurrected to their judgment. Many, all those who believe to life, and of course those who do not believe to a final eternity in separation from God. What is Peter doing with this text? Peter is demonstrating that what may look like unnecessary suffering on the outside, Jesus' death accomplished a goal. And then God, if you want to say it this way, rewarded Jesus, approved Jesus by giving him exaltation. This proved that Jesus was truly the one sent by God. It means that while Jesus was taken care of by the Father, and Noah was proved true by the flood coming when he was building the ark, so too any suffering that we may encounter or endure is going to be vindicated in some way, in some form, at some time. What things that we need to think about then as we go through? It may be difficult, but we can look back on Jesus, and his suffering was not without purpose. It did not come without vindication. His resurrection and his exaltation demonstrate that God does take care of those who suffer for him, those who are committed to him, and those who are faithful to him, regardless of circumstance and situation. It just depends on when God does that. It may be before others. It may be ultimately in the presence of God himself. We did see again in some form or fashion that Noah is vindicated because, as Hebrews said, he preached righteousness, and he was ridiculed for it. But the rains came and the floods rose. And of course, there were those who were destroyed in the flood, and only Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives were preserved. One side note to that is that it may be that as Christians, Peter is talking to a group of people who make up a very, very small portion of the human race at that time. And there's the idea of remnant then. The point there is that what God has done for Noah, what God has done for Jesus, he can do for us as well. That suffering is not in vain. God will not abandon you. You're going to have times when you feel abandoned, but God will not abandon you. What happens, for whatever reason the suffering is, there's ultimately a purpose that God has for us. It may be to teach us something. It may be ultimately to bring us to stronger faith. It could be that it's a demonstration of how unjust people act, and that God will work to respond in a way that brings judgment on them at some point, at some time. Whatever the reason for our suffering, God can use it, even unjust suffering like he did with Jesus. And if Jesus' suffering was, quote, avenged, then followers of Jesus too will be avenged. I like the word vindicated. It means they're being proven true. Their faithfulness has been demonstrated and rewarded. The bringing us through suffering is God's way of saying, this was my faithful person, my faithful servant, and there will be reward for that. As we conclude, let me just say it this way. Peter will continue his exhortation to his readers in the next verses. We're going to be looking at chapter 4, verses 1 to 11 in the next lesson. And those passages will indicate how we as believers should continue to respond to suffering, given Jesus' own suffering, knowing that there is something on the other side, whether it's on the other side of our suffering in this life or suffering ultimately ending with our resurrection. The point is, Peter is saying there is a way that we need to live our lives in light of that. How are we going to suffer? He's given us hints in terms of attitude. Now he's going to give us other guidelines for what it means to suffer, given the bigger picture that he's given to us already. Let's stop there. We'll look forward to chapter 4, verses 1 through 11 in our next lesson. Let's have a word of prayer, and then we at least will give a title to what our lesson will be. Father, we thank you for this day. We know that there is much suffering in the world, and your people who are seeking to be faithful to you suffer for many reasons. We suffer for being Christians. We suffer for trying to live righteous lives, and we see that prevailing in many ways today. We are thankful for the promise given through Jesus and demonstrated even in Noah and others in the New Testament whose suffering was not in vain. We know that ultimately you will take care of those who are faithful to you and suffer on behalf of faith in you. And I just pray right now that as we conclude this lesson and think about next week's lesson, that we will recognize what is necessary for us as believers to conduct ourselves in a way that brings you glory and honor in the wake of our suffering. We do await that vindication. We do know that there is a promise that on the other side, be it in this life, on the other side of a specific act of suffering or persecution, or in the end, when we're all raised, we know that you are going to be with us and you do not abandon us. We thank you, Father, for Jesus' example. It's a hard example, but we thank you for it so that knowing you were with him, you will be with us. We love you and praise you and give you this lesson and pray you help us to implement it in our lives daily. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, next week's lesson is going to be entitled Love Covers It All. And so we'll look at the suffering, and we'll also talk about what role love will play in how we interact with one another. We'll be coming close to the conclusion of our unit. We only have a couple more lessons after this. Until then, peace be to you and love with faith from God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Grace be with you who love our Lord Jesus Christ with love incorruptible.